The half square triangle is a great little unit in patchwork piecing, and I want to show you a few ways to make half square triangles. Maybe take a little bit of the fear out of it. First, I'm going to show you how to make one half square triangle. So I am making 4-inch half square triangles today, but there is a little bit of a formula that I want to talk about. So when we are making a half square triangle, if I want to make one 4-inch half square triangle, I'm going to cut out 4-inch squares. And I am going to mark my sew line right down the center of that square. So when we're making half square triangles, we're going to be talking about a marking line and a sew line. So our marking line to make one half square triangle is right down the center. So you're going to cut the size square that you want that half square triangle to be. And then I've already done the sewing. So right sides together. We're going to sew right on top of our marking line. So to make one half square triangle, the mark line and the sew line are the same. And then I'm going to use a ruler just to give myself a nice little 1/4 inch. I'm going to go to either side of that sew line 1/4 inch and cut off the excess. So now I've got one half square triangle. These are always nice to save when you're going to make some smaller half square triangles. Next, we are going to sew 2 half square triangles. So your formula for making 2 half square triangles is we are going to go by the cut size. So in quilting, a lot of times we talk about the cut size and then we talk about the finished size. So I'm going with the cut size. To make a 4-inch half square triangle, to make 2 4-inch half square triangles, we are going to measure 4 inches plus 2 seam allowances, which is 1/2 inch. Our seam allowance is going to be 1/4 inch. So when I measure the squares to cut out, I'm measuring the cut size that I want, 4 inches plus 1/4 inch plus 1/4 inch. So my squares are going to be cut 4.5 inches. So again, right sides together. Now our marking line is going to be a little bit different. To make 2 half square triangles, we are going to be marking on either side of the center. So I'm going to, with a purple pen, I'm going to just mark that center so you can see what I'm talking about. That's the center. And then, let me just mark it again. This is in pencil, but I'm going to mark it again so you can see. Then I'm going to mark 1/4 inch on either side of that center line. So what we are doing is sewing 1/4 inch away from that center line. So this is what it's going to look like. Here is that center of the 2 squares, and you see how we are sewing 1/4 inch away from the center. Then we're going to cut it right down the middle, and that's going to give us 2 half square triangles. Now, the next one I think is my favorite because a lot of patchwork blocks call for 8 half square triangles of the same color. For instance, if you were doing a star pattern, a lot of different star patterns will call for 8 half square triangles. And I want to show you a couple of different ways to actually mark your lines. The first way is when we make 8 half square triangles, this is going to be the same as when we did 2 half square triangles, where we are going to sew 1/4 inch away from our center line. And so if we mark that center line, then we're going to sew 1/4 inch away. But I want to show you a little tool, which you actually don't have to use this tool, but I'll show you. This is a little tool that shows that center line. See how that is in black down the center of this little ruler, and then it's 1/4 of an inch wide on either side of that center line. So I can lay this ruler on my square, lining up that black line down the center, and then what I'm doing is I'm marking my sew lines. Instead of marking a center line and then sewing 1/4 of an inch away, the advantage of marking your sew line is that if 2 or 3 of us got together and said we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch away from our mark line, we're probably going to have 3 different seam allowances. So I like marking my sew line. Now, if you don't have a little ruler like this, you can take any ruler and line up 1/4 inch along the center. Do you see how I've got 1/4 of an inch hanging right over that center line? So then I can easily just mark that 1/4 inch away. So then this is what it's going to look like when it's sewn. So you don't see that my center through the fabric or through the square, but you can see that I've sewn 1/4 of an inch away from that. Now, after you sew your seams, pretty much on any size of half square triangles, do you see how I've got a little bit of puckering in here? The fabric is going to just move a little bit. Sometimes your stitch might be a little bit tight. So especially on this bigger size, it's always a good idea to bring it over to the iron and to give this a nice little pressing before we do any cutting. That's so nice because that just works all the little puckering right out of that. I'm doing it on both sides for good measure, just because we can. And so now it's time to cut. So when you're cutting for 8, the easiest thing, we are going to be cutting this kind of like a pie. And so I'm going to cut through the part of my squares that is not marked, right? That's going to be the easiest place to cut through. I like to say that you're going to be cutting a plus mark and then an X. So we're going to cut through this way. And you see, we line that ruler right where these seams are crisscrossing. And then we're going to go this way, and we're going to cut across here. Now we're going to cut right down the center. So if for some reason this moves around, don't worry, you can cut each of these separately if you want to. When you're cutting with the rotary cutter, you want to really stabilize that ruler. We're going to cut through, and now you've got 8 half square triangles. Isn't that awesome? So now let's talk a little bit about pressing our half square triangles. So on this block, you can see that we definitely have a nice contrast with light and dark. If you lay your half square triangle on your ironing board with the dark fabric up, then you know you're always going to be pressing towards that dark side. One little trick that I like to do is I like to lay them not right on top of each other, but I like to stagger my half square triangles. Let me do a little reach. I like to just stagger them. So the reason that I want to press that seam allowance to the dark side is so it's not showing up on my lighter fabric. And when I press my half square triangles and stagger them like this, I don't think you can ever press a half square triangle too much. So now they're all nice and pressed. This is a nice and flat. Most of the time, in a perfect world, when we cut up our half square triangles, they're going to end up the perfect size, but they usually don't. So I'm going to use a ruler that has, I'm going to hold that still. So it has a line in that ruler that is a 45-degree angle. And the reason that that is nice is that we're going to take our half square triangle, we're going to lay this over the ruler. Now remember, I wanted a 4-inch half square triangle. So I'm going to line the seam of my half square triangle right along that 45-degree angle that is marked on the ruler. And then here you can see that I've just counted over 4 inches. So I've got the inside of this half square triangle lined up on that 4-inch line. Again, secure that ruler nicely. We're going to cut this way. And, ooh, I was really close. And we're going to cut that way. We'll cut off that little dog ear. That's that little leftover piece. And now we've got a nice squared up half square triangle, and you are ready for your patchwork piecing.